Lionhead's reign as an independent developer was over, and although they sold the company to keep as many of the current staff employed as possible, many who remained felt that Lionhead had just sold its soul. And in a lot of ways, it had. For the younger Lionhead employees, the buyout came as a cultural change. But many of the veteran staff who were there for the early days of Bullfrog knew only too well what a corporate overlord was capable of, and rightly feared what changes Microsoft might bring. In order to stay alive as a company, they'd had to make the deal with Microsoft. But part of the deal with Microsoft was contingent on making and producing Fable 3. So the people at Lionhead Studios did what they did best, and put aside their emotions, their worry, and their anger to create a good game. 2 years later, Fable 2 arrived on October 21st, 2008, and sold over 790,000 copies in the US on the first month. It eventually went on to sell over 3.5 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling RPG for the Xbox 360. Now, as they looked ahead to the future, they'd only have 18 months to make Fable 3. It's come up a lot in the recent years as people pored back over Lionhead Studios' history. But why exactly did they have 18 months only to make the third iteration of the game, when all the other games before this took over 4 years to develop and make? As a warning, this next part is speculation, but through interviews at the time and articles published more recently, we can kind of guess as the reason why it only took 18 months to make the game. The Fable series had been an incredibly lucrative investment so far for Microsoft, earning back 2 or 3 times what was spent on development. But the reality was Fable wasn't as popular as something like Halo. The RPG market just wasn't as big as the first-person shooter market, and as such, Fable always found itself under scrutiny by analysts at Microsoft who pushed for higher profits, shorter development time, and more market appeal. This kind of mounting pressure is what probably led to the decision to shoot for Fable 3's release in 18 months. The prevailing thought at the time was that if they used the existing infrastructure from Fable 2 and made that the base for Fable 3, they'd have much less work to do in order to get the game up and running. That was the hope at the time, but development of Fable 3 proved to be a bit more chaotic than they initially thought. 18 months was a very short time to turn around a game. Not only did the 18 months play a huge role in Fable 3's problems, but during development they had to deal with Peter Molyneux, who was now in an entirely new position within Microsoft. After the acquisition and buyout, Molyneux was promoted to creative director of Microsoft Game Studios in Europe, and he would constantly travel between Lionhead Studios and Rare, where he assisted Rare with the development of Kinect Sports. Despite all this travel time, he still remained the creative director over both Fable 2 and Fable 3. With his time and attention split between the two studios, it's come as no surprise that issues arose during development, as Peter would swoop into these design meetings for Fable 3 after being away for months on end, and suddenly start suggesting features to add to the game. Design documents at that point were less than useless, because he would have some of the final say in what would go into the game or what he wanted to add. That made it very, very chaotic to have something grounded in such a short development window. On top of that, a decision was made to implement the Kinect into an assortment of minigames for Fable 3. They even had a few working prototypes near the end of those 18 months, but they were eventually just taken out because it was nowhere near as polished as it should have been. They didn't have the time to play with the Kinect software and refine the games they'd built in order to fit into the narrative of Fable 3. So the failed minigames, the short development window, and Molyneux swooping in with last-minute additions made Fable less than what it should have been. It was still, by all accounts, a great game, but it suffered a lot of technical issues that took months to get patched, if they were patched at all. The game's combat was criticized for being overly simple, and the pace of the story seemed to drag on at points and just not elevate enough at others. But mostly it was criticized for the lack of innovation that Lionhead has become known for. Some of that lack of innovation might have been because the studio had been working with the Fable IP for over 12 years now. Since the founding of Lionhead, they'd never been people to really jump on the bandwagon for sequel after sequel. They wanted to try new things. Being stuck in creating Fable and sticking for Fable for so long caused enthusiasm at the studio to reach an all-time low. The Fable series was established. It had its own set of rules, characters, and history, and they were so ready to work on something else. Even if it came at the cost of just a few months of a side project, just something. When Molyneux first heard about Project Natal, which would later become known globally as the Xbox Kinect, they began work on a game using the Kinect as the sole input device, instead of the normal controller. Milo and Kate was a game that allowed you to play as an imaginary friend to a boy named Milo. You helped him with chores, you played with him, and tagged along in his day-to-day life. It was something entirely new, more like an interactive movie rather than a game. The early demo was enough to convince some of the executives at Microsoft to greenlight the upcoming 2009 E3 demonstration, but there was one problem. Milo and Kate was still very much a work in progress. To ensure that they got a good audience at E3, and to ensure that the demonstration went absolutely perfectly, the game scenes were rendered out well in advance to prevent visual screen tears or irregularities, and a professional actress was hired to play with Milo in a pre-scripted event. They did this for two reasons. One, the tech behind the Kinect wasn't advanced enough to prevent input issues. At that time, it had problems tracking the player and recognizing voice commands. The second reason was, Milo was nowhere near as advanced as Molyneux was claiming he was. Molyneux, in that same E3 demonstration about Milo and Kate, exaggerated some of the features about how advanced Milo as an AI was. I remember in one scene of the demonstration, the actress hands a piece of paper up to the Kinect camera, and then on screen, Milo holds up a piece of paper and interprets what she drew on it. And that kind of tech just wasn't possible at the time. I mean, it would have been freaking sweet if that was ever possible, but there was just no way. And many people called immediate bullshit to it, and rightly so. Later on, Aaron Greenberg, Xbox's marketing executive, later came out to say that the 2009 E3 demonstration of Milo and Kate had been nothing but a tech demo. But Molyneux decided to double down, and during a TED Global talk in Oxford, he went on to directly contradict Aaron Greenberg and say that it was a full-fledged game. Microsoft at that time had been pressuring Molyneux to end his involvement with the project, even so much as saying, go ahead, just shelve it. But Molyneux went behind their backs to develop the game more, and he was hoping that the TED Talk would inspire them, give them a reason to fund the project. But Microsoft just didn't see Milo and Kate as a worthwhile investment. No matter how hard Molyneux pursued it, he just couldn't convince them that the game was worthwhile investment. And from a Microsoft business standpoint, it kind of made sense. The kind of interaction he was talking about with the Kinect would require an assload of money to be poured into the Kinect in order to make the game. It just didn't make fiscal sense for something that was more of an emotional connection type game that lacked a lot of the fundamental elements that they wanted to play with. They really just wanted Fable. They had bought Lionhead Studios so they would make more Fable games. That was it. And when they told Molyneux just the project was canceled, that was the end of it. After Project Milo's cancellation, Molyneux just wasn't the same. His passion and energy for game development had just been entirely stripped away. And I don't know whether that's because he spent more time out of the studio, or whether because he came to the realization that we're stuck working on Fable. There's... I don't know. I expect a little bit of both. Everything just kind of came crashing down around Molyneux after the Project Milo demonstration. People brought up the lies he'd told at Bullfrog, the hype he'd given for Black and White and the features that just weren't there. And people even brought up the Acorn incident. Everyone just stopped believing in him and supporting him in the way that they used to in the past. Every public appearance he made was met with ridicule and derision, and comments would pop up on YouTube and in forums about how Project Milo was just another in a long string of broken promises made by the infamous liar Peter Molyneux. His passion project was dead, his studio effectively under Microsoft's control. He couldn't get himself away from Fable. Sad to say, it was a very dark time. And on a dreary Monday in 2012, the final blow would be hammered home and end his career with Lionhead Studios. On that dreary Monday, Stuart White, John McCormick, and a handful of other Lionhead veterans, disheartened with the direction the company was headed, marched into Molyneux's office and told him they were quitting. On top of the cancellation of Milo and Kate, he had to watch the studio that he'd founded, the amazing creative studio filled with an endless supply of talent, just fall apart around him. People were leaving left and right. People that had been with him since the beginning in the early days of Bullfrog were abandoning ship. I can only imagine it must have been very hard for him, knowing that this wasn't the same company he'd started with Tim Rance, Steve Jackson, and Mark Webley. Lionhead had been made with the idea to take risks, be bold, and challenge the idea of what a game could be. It wasn't a company that made endless sequels and just safe games. It's not what he wanted. Not long after his friends left, the staff were gathered at the canteen, and with a heavy heart, Peter Molyneux bid them a very sad farewell. He was leaving Lionhead forever. I don't usually interject personal feelings into the history of videos because I want to remain as impartial as possible. I know Peter Molyneux rubs people the wrong way. The hype and promises he made were outlandish and sometimes ridiculous. But it isn't right to write off the legacy of this man as just a liar. He was passionate about what he did. And the people at the studio, who should have hated him for all the shit they went through, knew that a majority of what he did for the sake of creating those few brilliant ideas. Despite all the lies, the broken promises, and the scandals that would come later in his career with Goddess, I want to believe that the words and promises we've heard over Molyneux's very long career were the words of an excited creator hoping to shoot for the stars. However else you may feel about the man, Lionhead and the gaming world wouldn't be the same without him. The canceling of Milo and Kate showed that Fable was the only thing Microsoft wanted. And once Peter left the studio to found 22 Cans across the street, Microsoft became the overlords that many feared they might be after acquisition. I'm not sure if Molyneux held back the Microsoft storm, or they genuinely thought Lionhead needed them after Molyneux left. But Microsoft became more and more involved in the studio's day-to-day activities. So it was ultimately decided by a lot of the staff that if they had to make a Fable game, they wanted to make the best damn Fable that they could. They wanted to shoot for the freaking moon. The first Fable had taken place in a quiet village. Fable 2 had been set in a developing town. Fable 3 was a city. Fable 4 would be set in a futuristic depiction of London. John McCormick made the pitch for Fable 4 to Microsoft, and they immediately shot him down. Microsoft was getting ready to launch the Xbox One on November 2013, and with the launch of the new console, they were also chasing a new market strategy. The Xbox One would be a living room media companion that virtually allowed you to do everything. Whether that was watch TV, stream, or play video games, the Xbox One could do it all. This shift from a gaming console to an all-inclusive media machine also came with the idea of games being made as a service. Microsoft wanted to get involved in the lucrative free-to-play models of certain video games, like League of Legends or Candy Crush, which were proving to be ridiculous moneymakers. The microtransactions would allow a developer to rake in revenue by incentivizing players to spend money on energy, new skins, or player features. McCormick's pitch for the future of Fable 4 was rejected because Microsoft wanted to push the idea of games as a service to their platform in order to maximize profits. And thus, the game no one but Microsoft wanted, Fable Legends, was born. Fable Legends would be the last game Lionhead Studios would work on, and ultimately play a major part in the company's eventual closure. In order to properly facilitate Microsoft's request to push games as a service, they began hiring new people. David Eckelberry, a consultant who had previously worked on a few titles with microtransactions, and John Needham, who had worked on various free-to-play games over the past years. They also began to hire a few competitive multiplayer game designers to fit the bill of what Fable Legends would be. The basic premise of the game they wanted was pretty similar to Dungeon Keeper. They were going to pit players who would play as various Fable heroes against another player who controlled the part of villain. The Fable heroes would fight against waves of enemies, bosses, and levels in order to reach the final boss. The player controlling the villain would control the field from the perspective of a real-time strategy game, trying to kill the heroes. If they managed to pull this off, they would show that even without Molyneux at the helm, Lionhead could create amazing games. They also held on to the hopes that once they completed building Fable Legends, maybe, just maybe, Microsoft would see what they were capable of doing and greenlight Fable 4. Of course, since Lionhead had never made a game like this before, they ran into some major problems during development. The game had to be balanced in a very unique way. For instance, could the heroes level up? And if so, what kind of system would the villain need to keep up with the heroes? What exactly happens if you get teamed up with less skilled heroes? Could a competent villain just roll over your team? Can heroes resurrect one another? If they can, how do you balance that with the villain's side? It was a tough task, and with every feature they put in the game, a host of balance questions arose and needed to be addressed. Lionhead did the best they could. After all, this was completely uncharted territory for them. They would spend months testing ideas, then decide to scrap them in favor of doing something else due to balance concerns. Development, financially, spiraled out of control. When starting the project, Microsoft had told the members of Lionhead that the game would be an Xbox One exclusive. Later, they recanted that and decided to make it cross-platform for Windows 10. The sudden change opened up a veritable Pandora's box of security issues. Once opened up to the PC environment, it would introduce the possibility of cheating into the equation, which hadn't been planned for at the time. Because of this, the project grew more complex and expensive by the day. Development of Fable Legends had officially began in 2012, after the release of Fable the Journey. In 2016, the game was close to an early beta. The total cost sunk into the project so far had been close to $75 million. An absolutely insane amount of money that would take a decade to earn back using a free-to-play model. And that's if the game didn't bomb after release. It came as no surprise later, on March 7, 2016, when all the staff received an email asking everyone to assemble in the cafe. Hanno Lemke, general manager of Microsoft Studios Europe, arrived and the cafe grew silent. Lemke announced that Fable Legends would be cancelled. Not only that, but Lionhead Studios would be closing next month. Everyone was shocked. They knew that Fable Legends might get the axe, but nobody expected Lionhead might too. And just like that, 20 years of history would be coming to a close, and 100 people would find themselves out of a job come April. Microsoft has never officially commented on the closure of the studio and what led to that decision. There's a lot of speculation still about it. They wanted to get rid of the cost of Fable Legends, they didn't have a good financial year in video games, the Fable franchise just wasn't profitable enough for them to continue development. All those things could very well be the reason the studio was closed. But the stark reality is, no one truly knows why. On April 29th, Lionhead Studios closed its doors for good. Employees past and present went to the pub, as was tradition, and said their goodbyes. It was a very sad day. Not because the studio had closed, but because friends who'd spent the last 20 years together were going their separate ways. These people were family, and Lionhead had become their home, filled with a lifetime of memories, personal triumphs, and achievements that should never be forgotten. The history of Lionhead Studios is a sad tale, but one that shouldn't be forgotten. Lionhead gave so many people their first opportunity, and gave them enough slack to flourish creatively. Many of these talented developers, programmers, and artists are out in the gaming world today, still fulfilling that Lionhead promise to innovate and create.